Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends. I'm here with my friend Ty Esslinger, and Ty and I are continuing our Bible study. This is a real Bible study that we're doing together. We're in the book of First Corinthians. We have been in chapter 7. Last week we were in chapter 7, the first 9 verses of chapter 7. This is the chapter on relationships, the chapter where Paul is answering a lot of questions about marriage and divorce from the Corinthian church. They had a number of issues, and we'll talk about that as we go along, but we're in the midst of that. We're starting at verse 10. Now, the first section of this, if we look at the first 9 verses, we pull out a little bit and show the bracket here. The first 9 verses from 1 to 9 are principles of married life. This is married life in general. Basically talking to the husband, talking to the wife. This is just married life specifically. Now, starting at verse 10, we're going to be talking about principles for married Christians. And there's 2 things I want us to really notice here. I'm not going to get bogged down because there's some great teaching on divorce and marriage on YouTube. I'm not going to try to get an exhaustive teaching on that. I'm going to try to get through what these verses are talking about and not do a lot of other things. That make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, now, one of the things I want us to notice that's worthwhile is the first 9 verses that just is marriage in principle, right?
Yeah.
Talks to the man and the woman. Right, and talks about their rights and what they should be doing in the marriage, and what marriage should look like as a unit. All right. Now he's going to get into very specific things about principles for Christians that are married. And the first place he goes, I want us to notice this. Who is he addressing? Now I want us to go. Let me start to read this. Now he says, to the married people, I give this charge. Not I, but the Lord. In other words, this is inspired. This is the Lord told me to teach you this. The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried and else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. So the first people that are addressed, the first type of person that is addressed in that in 10 and 11 is who?
Married
definitely, but
clearly having issues.
Okay, married having issues, but specifically the woman. Notice this: to the married I give this charge, not I. The wife should not separate from her husband. Now that's huge, because in the culture, in the first century secular culture, women did not have the rights of divorce in the Jewish culture. And remember,
I did not know that.
Half of what he's talking to the church in Corinth are Jewish believers, and the other half are Gentile believers. So the Jewish believers, to hear, I want to talk about marriage within the church now, and I want to talk about you women should not separate from your husbands. Wait a minute. Does that mean I have the right to separate from my husband? Well, Paul's going to address that right and say, you really shouldn't. But if you do, you should stay single or be reconciled. Now, who's the instigator in that verse? Who is initiating the action?
The woman.
The woman. Interesting. Now, Paul comes from a Jewish background, but in the context of the church, immediately he's starting to lay out some women's rights in the context of the church marriage community. That a woman can make some decisions regarding herself and her marriage. He says you shouldn't just run off and separate from your husband, but if you need to, if you do, you should stay single or work at reconciling with him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, kind of almost as an afterthought, and the husband should not divorce his wife. Now that's interesting because in the Jewish culture and in a lot of the secular culture, all a man had to do to divorce his wife was say, I don't love you anymore, get out. And that was it. And the woman had to leave. The man was totally in control of that idea of, I can just decide to divorce her, and I can on any grounds I want. If I'm just tired of her, I can just say, hey, go away, and I can divorce her. I can give her a writ of divorce. She's gone. So all of a sudden, he's saying within the church community, whether you're Gentile believers or Jewish believers, we should treat marriage a little differently. And number one is women have some rights. Now, what comes with rights is also responsibility. So women have a responsibility not to treat marriage lightly and just say, hey, I'm leaving my husband. And husbands shouldn't treat marriage lightly and just say to the wife, you're gone, right?
Yeah.
You see that there?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing he starts to set out. And it goes, now in verse 12, it says, to the rest I say. So now this is not the married Christian woman or the married Christian man, but to the rest of the church, I say, not I, but the Lord. He's saying this is inspired. Even when he says it's not the Lord, it's me, it's still inspired.
Yeah, because it's still in the canon.
Yeah. But he says, to the rest of the church, I say, if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever. Now, so he addresses believing wives who are Christians and have Christian husbands, and believing husbands who have Christian wives. Now he's going to say, to the rest of the church who are believers but may have a non-Christian mate, a non-Christian partner, he's going to address some things. And I want us to notice some things about what he addresses here. And we're paying attention to two things, women's rights and who is the initiator. Okay? So watch this. He says, if any brother, this is a Christian, has a wife who is an unbeliever, non-Christian, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. So this is a mandate to a Christian husband who's non-Christian, whose wife is non-Christian. He's become a Christian. And he says, my wife is not a Christian, so I should just divorce her because she's not a Christian. And Paul is saying, wait a minute, if she wants to stay married, even if she's not a believer, if she wants to stay married to you, do not divorce her. That's a command.
Yeah.
Okay? Now that gives her, the non-believing woman, some rights, where the believing husband can't just say, well, you're not a believer, you're gone. And this happens to Christians where you're married and you become a Christian. And you go, well, I become a Christian, I'm born again, I want to follow the Lord, but my wife isn't a believer and she doesn't quite get it. So should I just dump her? No, you shouldn't. Okay? If she wants to continue the relationship, you should not be the initiator of a divorce. Now it says, he should not divorce her. If any woman, now he's addressing the woman.
Right.
If the woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, so now he's addressing Christian women.
Right.
If you are a Christian woman and you have a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. So it's the Christian should not be the initiator of a divorce towards a non-believing mate. If the non-believing mate wants to remain married, It is the responsibility of the Christian husband or Christian wife to stay married.
Yep. There's
Go ahead.
there's not really a way out of that.
Yeah, she should not divorce him. He should not, right there, verse 12, he should not divorce her. Verse 13, she should not divorce him. If the non-believer, and he or she, if the non-believer wants to continue to be married, the husband and wife who are Christians should not initiate a divorce. Should not divorce them. Okay? Now, he's going to get into some details here. He's going to say, because he said, don't divorce her and don't divorce him, because the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children should be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Now, let me talk about this for a second.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about a believing husband with a non-believing wife. His faith makes her a Christian. He's talking about his faith and his lifestyle as a believing husband or a believing wife will sanctify the relationship and make it a more righteous one, in that she wants to live pleasing to the Lord. So she's going to live in a way that the entire relationship becomes righteous.
Okay.
All right. Now look over at 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 through 5. This is Peter, not Paul writing. This is Peter writing, different author, but it's the same line here. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 through 5.
Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your
Adornment, yeah.
be external, the branding of the hair.
Yep, braiding the hair. He starts to talk about how they dress and how they conduct themselves as
Right.
wives. But the point is, what he makes in 1 Peter earlier in 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2, is that a Christian wife can be a testimony to a non-Christian husband just by the way she lives. And she can be a witness to him and start to affect his lifestyle because of the way she wants to live. And that's the same thing that Paul's getting across here with this idea of the unbelieving husband or the unbelieving wife is made holy. His lifestyle is much more righteous because the believing one, the believing mate, is living out his faith in his lifestyle. So that makes a positive. It could ultimately win them to the Lord. But even if they don't become Christians right then and there, where the wife says, I became a believer, and the husband says, I don't know. Just by watching her change life, I've heard so many testimonies where the husband says, my wife became a Christian, and I just noticed she was a different person. And I started to pay attention because of that. Lee Strobel, who became a Christian, wrote A Case for Christ. His wife became a Christian, and he says, I started to explore this whole thing about Christ because she was a changed person, and I was impressed.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what Paul is saying here. The unbelieving husband, the reason that a believing husband or a believing wife should stick with a non-believing husband or wife that wants to stay together is because by doing that, he can have a real ministry in their life, or she can have a real ministry.
Yeah. It would be so hard to be the believing one in a lopsided marriage like that.
It is, and that is where we who are going into our marriages need to pay really close attention to whether our prospective mate is a believer or not. In fact, look up, I got here, the husband who is an unbeliever. Look up at 2 Corinthians. We're in 1 Corinthians. Later,
Right.
he's going to really explain this to the Corinthian church. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14 to 16. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it?
You're smoother.
Okay, I'm smoother. I don't know that. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, he says, do not be unequally yoked. Okay?
Yep.
With unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial, which is Satan? And what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God, which is our bodies, with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Therefore, go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord.
Do you think they had the wrong idea of 1 Corinthians, and they thought that, like, it's good to be married 50-50, half and half? Like,
well,
is that where their confusion came from for a second?
We'll see in the context when we get to 2 Corinthians.
Yeah.
And I think in the context that created some questions about, well, wait a minute, an unbeliever and a believer and everything. Now, remember the earlier in 1 Corinthians, our study, one of the problems in the church is they just fundamentally misunderstood what the gospel was about.
Yeah.
They misunderstood grace. So they may have been very confused, as many people are today. What is a believer? And what is a non-believer? And why can't a non-believer and a believer be together? I know Christian young adults who start dating non-believers and become engaged and say, I'm going to marry her because I love her. Well, wait a minute. We need to be careful here, because 2 Corinthians is going to say, wait a minute, what kind of fellowship can a non-believer have with a believer? When the non-believer is a son of Satan and a believer is a child of God. We need to watch that. And by the way, that son of Satan thing is, Jesus said that non-believers were children of Satan. He owns them. So there's no basis for fellowship. Well, and Paul's getting to that. He's writing this to people who were non-Christians who became a Christian, and now they're in a mixed marriage.
Yeah.
He's not saying this is a principle for you who want to marry a non-Christian, because that's a whole different thing. He's going to address that in a little while. He's going to address it again in detail in 2 Corinthians. But you see, what he's talking about here is, for the sake of ministry, if a believing wife or a believing husband want to stay married, you stay married for the sake of two things. One is witnessing to your unbelieving spouse, and the other is being an example to your kids. Right?
Yeah.
Be an example to your kids. And that's what he's talking about. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. That is, your children are going to live like pagans. But if you're an example to your kids, even with a non-Christian spouse, you can have an influence on your kids and an influence on your spouse. All right? Now, then he's getting very practical here. He says, but, okay?
Yeah.
Verse 15, if the unbelieving partner, and that's huge, because now we're talking about the unbelieving partner, right? Up earlier, we were talking about the believing husband and the believing wife,
right,
who has a non-believing partner and non-believing wife who want to stay married. They should stay married. But here he's saying, now, if your non-believing partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. You're not enslaved to the marriage relationship if your non-believing husband or wife, leaves you. So who is the initiator?
The unbelieving partner.
See, the believing partner does not initiate. The non-believing partner says, if you've got a non-believing partner and they don't want to live with you anymore and they separated, let it be so. Because and then you're free. You're not enslaved to that marriage because they have initiated. Now, I tell Christians all the time that are having trouble that with a non-Christian mate and she or he is making it miserable on them. I say, let them take the action. You be a witness. Let them be the initiator of the divorce. You do not have the right under this specific circumstance to be the initiator.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And it says the brother or sister, the Christian, is not enslaved to the marriage. God has called you to peace. Now that's peace in your own life, but also peace in the relationship. If you've got a non-believer who wants to leave, you don't force them to stay. That's not peaceable. Okay? If they want to leave, I've heard of cases where the wife will divorce her husband and the grounds are, I got sick and tired of your cramming your religion down my throat. Well, all I did was become a Christian and start living like a Christian.
Yeah.
Okay? But they initiated. Now, it says in verse 16, how do you know? He says, because how do you know, wife, again, talking to the wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? In other words, you can't force them to stay because you say, oh, I'm gonna win them to the Lord. When they want to leave and they can't stand it and they say, I want out. There's no fellowship of light and darkness there. We know that from 2 Corinthians. Let them leave because you don't have a clue that by forcing them to stay, you can save their souls. You can win them to the Lord. You don't save their souls, the Lord saves their souls, but you know what I mean. Because that's what he's saying. How do you know, wife, or how do you know, husband, that you will save your wife or save your husband? You don't know. So if they absolutely want to leave, you can't tie them up and lock them in the basement and force them to stay. He said, don't do it. Let them leave. You're free. And it says, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all churches. Now, let me explain this a little bit. This is talking about being the initiator. If you're an unmarried believer, don't just take that as your assignment from the Lord. And don't work at being married. If you're a Christian who's married, even to a non-Christian, don't work to get out of it. That's the assignment the Lord has given you. He says, lead the life that the Lord has assigned you. So if the Lord has assigned you to live with a spouse who's not a believer, but wants to stay married, you stay married. That's your assignment. That's your mission field. If they don't want to stay married and they just say, I want out, let them go. Be peaceful. Be peaceable. Okay? That makes sense what he's saying? Very practical here. Now, he goes into such detail. This is an interesting thing. Many scholars, especially Jewish believers, believe that Paul had been married before. Because in Colossians and Galatians, he makes the point that he was a Pharisee before he was a Christian. And to be a Pharisee, one of the requirements to be a Pharisee was, in the first century, was you had to be married. So as a comer, a student of Gamaliel and a real shining star in the Jewish faith, as a young Pharisee and as one of the youngest members of the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of the Pharisees, he would have been married, and he would have been married to a very proper Jewish wife. Now, she's not mentioned. When he becomes a Christian and he becomes a radical follower of Jesus, okay? And there's 14 years before he goes on his first missionary journey. From the time he first becomes Christian to the time he goes on his first missionary journey. During that time, most scholars are saying that as a Pharisee, he stops being a Pharisee and he starts to become a radical Christian. His proper Jewish wife, who would have been an unbeliever, would have said, "This is not what I signed up for," and would have divorced him. And that's why Paul is going into such great detail about his understanding of someone who's married to a non-Christian who doesn't want to stay in the marriage. He understands. And he says, let him go. Then he says, now that means I'm single again. That doesn't mean I go out and get him married right away, but I live focused on the Lord. He's going to talk about that in a little while. But does that make sense? That gives Paul a real insight. God is using Paul's life experience as a Christian to write down spiritual truth for us in the church. That if we have a non-believing wife who wants to stay, or a non-believing husband who wants to stay, we stay and minister to them. If we have a non-believing husband or a non-believing wife that absolutely refuses to stay, doesn't want to have any part of our faith, we let them leave. They initiate the separation.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. I realized I had been muted for some of those affirmatives.
Yeah, okay. You're shaking your head. Yeah, okay, fine. So that idea is only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, whether he's married to another believer, married to a non-believer who wants to stay married, or married to a non-believer who leaves him, and all of a sudden he's single again. They're single again. That's the assignment God has given you to live.
Yeah.
Live it. And he says this is a rule that I say to all the churches. This isn't just for Corinth. This is for all of the churches. This is not a special case teaching.
Right.
So this is abiding in God's call is the place in life that God has called you to be. Don't you, Christian, be the initiator to make major changes in it. You go with what God has called you to do. If God has called you to minister to a non-believing spouse that wants to stay married, you minister. If God has freed you with a non-believing spouse that wants to leave, and they initiate it, they leave, then you stay as called to be a single divorcee. Now, that could change.
If your desire is to be in a different stage, right, whether it be like single to married or married to back to single, like it can be very distracting to be consumed by that desire.
Yeah, and he's going to talk later in this chapter, a little later in this chapter, next lesson. He's going to talk about it's better to be single and totally focused on the Lord, because if you're married, you're going to have a split focus. Because
right.
You need to minister to your wife and submit to the Lord. So you've got a split focus. He said, I'd rather have you just be have the gift of singleness, where you could single-mindedly follow the Lord. Now, I want to end with his last verse, in this verse 18. Was anyone at the time of his call, that is the time he became Christian, already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. And anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised, let him not seek circumcision. In other words, stay with the the circumstances that you were when you were a non-Christian. He's saying there, if you were a Gentile non-Christian and you became a Christian, you don't have to become a Jew and then a Christian. And
Yeah.
you're circumcised. If you were a Jew who becomes a Christian, and you're a Jewish believer, you don't have to be ashamed of the fact that you're circumcised. Try to be uncircumcised. I don't even know how you do uncircumcised. But anyway, but he says, just live out the life God has assigned you to live. And that's that section on, this is the principle of abiding where God has called you, and abiding in the circumstances of your life when you're called to be a Christian.
Right. Where you're at now is your mission field.
That's right.
And
now, if God changes that, you start out with a non-believing spouse who says, "I want to stay married," and you're ministering and you're living your life and you're growing as a Christian, and at the same time you're witnessing to her, witnessing to your kids, and all of a sudden she says, "I don't want to stay. I don't want to be married anymore." Then the rule goes in that she is the initiator and she leaves. But we as Christians should not say, "Oh, it'd be really nice if I had a believing wife, so I'll dump this one and get a believing wife." That's not grounds for divorces, my Christian friends. It just isn't. We're going to stop there. 33 minutes. We went down to verse 18. Now we're going to pick up at 19 with him continuing this thought of circumstances in our lives. And he's going to continue to do this of pay attention to the circumstances of your life when you become a Christian, because that is an important circumstance. And we can deal with that now. This is not law, this is grace, but these are principles for the people in the church to live by. And that's what he says. I got this from the Lord, and I'm giving it to you as a principle for living. We're going to stop there. This is tough stuff, but it's very modern issues, isn't it? I mean, this happens in the church all the time. This happens to people that become Christians all the time. We've got to deal with this, and we got to deal with it biblically, and we got to deal with it seasoned with grace and correct. And one of the key issues is the women have their rights, and us men need to respect that. And also, Christians need to be careful about being the initiator. Okay? We need to really be careful about being the initiator. We should initiate the presentation of the gospel in our lifestyle is what we should initiate, not initiate divorces. So we'll pick up on 19. Thank you guys on YouTube for sitting in on our Bible study, Ty and I. We hope that you were blessed. Please subscribe, and I'd love to hear your comments and questions. If you've got a question that's too lengthy for me to answer, I might do a video just on that question. Who knows? But I will not embarrass you, I promise, and I will reply just as quickly as I can. And I'd love to hear your comments. I'd love to hear if you have any other thoughts about what else you'd like Ty and I to study. Also, hit your like button. That helps us with the algorithm. Ty and I were talking about that off camera, where when you hit like, it tells YouTube that you are engaged in our content. And that helps us show up in other people's search offerings, preferences, suggestions. So thank you so much. I'm going to end here. God bless you. And we'll see you next week. We'll start at chapter 7, verse 19. And we should finish out, we could very well finish out the chapter, because it really kind of moves. It's a lot of verses, but it kind of moves through there with some pretty strong principles. Read ahead and be ready when we do that next week. God bless you. We'll see you then.